So to begin Unit 3, we will take a look at the British and colonial relations up to the Revolutionary War. And we're really going to take a look into the causes of the American Revolution and the consequences of it. Because the sort of irony is that after Britain wins the Seven Years' War, the war actually sort of starts to destabilize the British Empire. And so while it looks like on paper the British Empire is incredibly powerful in North America now, with the French largely kicked out, in reality, the war really completely depleted their treasury, and that led to a lot of tensions rising between American colonists and Parliament as to who would actually pay for the cost of this incredibly long and difficult conflict. So our goals for today are going to be fairly simple. First is going to be understand the causes of the American Revolution. Second, understand the impact of the American Revolutionary War on communities throughout North America. And lastly, we're going to examine the consequences of the American Revolution on society, because the American Revolution has a lot of important consequences for the people who lived in North America. It not only created a new sovereign nation in the United States, but it really changed the lives of many different Native Americans and of enslaved peoples in this new country as well. So to begin, we're going to take a look at what happens immediately following the end of the Seven Years' War. And so, if you'll remember, at the end of the Seven Years' War, Britain is able to establish control over, or at least gain sort of the right of conquest to the Great Lakes region, where the French had lots of different forts and traded with native nations in modern-day Ohio, modern-day Michigan, modern-day Illinois, and Indiana. And so the British take control of many of these different forts and build their own forts in this new region. And the British have a huge problem in actually setting up good relations with the native nations of this region. For really decades, the Anishinaabe, the Ottawa especially, the Shawnee, the Miami, and the Lenape peoples all were close trade partners with the French and had good relations with the French, where they would trade furs for material goods and for weapons and ammunition. And the British didn't really understand how to establish relations with these people who still controlled this land. Remember, there weren't many French settlers around this in this period. And in this region. And so the British come into a place that's really controlled by native nations, and they don't really know how to establish proper relations. And so almost immediately, this a British general named General Amherst is sort of given control or sort of sovereignty over this region, and he makes a bunch of decisions that really make all the native nations of this region very angry. And so one of the first things General Amherst does is he actually builds a fort near modern-day Sandusky in Ohio. And this building, the building of this British fort, is actually in violation of a treaty that said the British would not build any new forts in this region. And as well, he changes policies in terms of the types of goods that the British were allowed native nations to receive from colonial powers in this region. And so he actually restricts the giving of gifts to Native American nations and the regular trade of firearms to Native nations as well. And this really goes in the face of a lot of established agreements that Native nations had with the French, where the French would sort of give annual gifts to native nations to show that they are still their friend. And in a lot of native Algonquin culture, if you cut off trade that was actually an act of war. And so what General Amherst was doing was almost declaring war on these nations of the Ohio Valley. And so um, uh, many prominent leaders at the time sort of began to organize against the British. And so a Lenape prophet by the name of Neolin begins arguing uh, that Native nations haven't actually received many benefits from trading with Europeans. And so Neolin argues that they should cut off all contact with Europeans, stop trading with them, um, try to adopt more traditional aspects of their own cultures, and resist against any European encroachment on native land. And so Neolin is almost is going around basically arguing that native nations should resist the British militarily. And then you have some more practical leaders of these nations who begin organizing new alliances against the British, because these policies by Amherst really offend the Anishinaabe and the Shawnee and the Miami. And so leaders begin to organize against the British. And one of these leaders is a person by the name of Pontiac, who is a prominent Ottawa chief, who joins together with the Anishinaabe of modern day sort of northern Michigan. And so on this map, this would be the Ojibwa, as another name for the Anishinaabe people. Um, Pontiac joined as well with the Potawatomi, the Wyandot, around modern-day Sandusky, the Miami, around modern-day northern Indiana and Fort Wayne, as well as the Lenape and the Shawnee. And this alliance of Algonquin nations in Michigan and Ohio simultaneously revolt against the British and attack all of these newly manned British forts. And this revolt is incredibly successful, actually. Looking at this map, all the forts with sort of a burn symbol next to them are forts that are successfully burned down and destroyed by this alliance of native nations. And so you'll see the British lost a lot of their forts in modern days northern Indiana and northern Ohio and western Pennsylvania. And all these forts are burned down. And the British are actually forced to rescind a lot of Amherst's policies. The British open up regular trade with native nations, and they adopt the same sort of policies that the French had before the British arrived in this territory. And so this revolt is actually quite successful. And so while the British still have some presence in this area in modern day Detroit, in modern day Pittsburgh, they do change their policies and they start adopting those sort of more conciliatory French policies, opening up trade, and this was exactly what this Native Alliance wanted. And so it's through resistance that effectively these native nations are able to retake their territory and land in the Ohio River Valley, and coerce the British into trading more goods, and in renegotiating their alliances with these peoples. And Pontiac's rebellion not only changes policies in the Ohio River Valley, but also changes British policies throughout North America. And so Pontiac's rebellion really spooks the British Empire, because the British Empire has already spent lots of money, time, and effort to fight the French and to win this large global conflict in the 7 Years' War. And so when this native rebellion in the Ohio River Valley is very successful and they lose many forts, the British are like, we cannot afford another war. And in the sort of the treasury, the British Empire is really emptied out. They don't have enough money to actually afford raising an army, and so they adopt a more conciliatory policy towards Native Americans, not only in the Ohio Valley, but also further south as well. So one of the key things they do is they pass this act called the Proclamation Act of 1763. And what the Proclamation Act specifically states is that American colonists are not allowed to cross a line around the modern day Appalachian Mountains because they don't want American colonists squatting on native territory, stealing native land, and then starting wars with these powerful native nations, which the British Empire cannot afford to fight. And so they establish this line, and they say no American colonists are allowed to cross this line in around the modern day Appalachian Mountains. And so this actually restricts the abilities of colonists to get new land out west by stealing it from native nations. And so you can see on this map, the Proclamation line is right here. It's sort of in light green, so it's a little bit hard to see, but it's right along the Appalachian Mountains. And so the Proclamation line actually makes a lot of American colonists very angry at the British. It especially angers those colonists who are surveyors because this proclamation line isn't great heavily enforced, and so poor farmers are still able to go and squat and take territory, though they do so really at their own risk. This is the British also saying, we don't have the troops to protect you. So if you're found squatting on, say, Shawnee territory in southern Ohio, and the Shawnees find out and come and kill you, the British aren't going to do anything about it, right? But who this act really hurts are a middle class and upper class Americans who are surveyors. And the role of surveyors is to go out to native territory, find land, sort of codify it, survey it, tell its quality, and then gain ownership and title to that land from the British Empire, and then sell it and make a big profit. And it's kind of surprising if you actually look at a lot of the who we'd consider the founding fathers, the number of these individuals who engaged, who were surveyors, is pretty substantial. So George Washington was a surveyor, Thomas Jefferson was a surveyor, James Madison, I believe, was also involved in land sales in the West. These are all people who stood to gain a lot by removing the Proclamation Act of 1763. And so this leads to a lot of tension among elite American colonists who want a more expansionistic policy against native nations, but don't want to pay the taxes to actually support the militaries that would be required to defeat native nations on the battlefield. And so this was one of the key things that actually leads to a deterioration of British and colonial relations in the 1760s. But another aspect of this is that the American colonists in Britain disagree almost philosophically on how the American colony should be run. And so Britain, over the course of the 1600s, went through a lot of different revolutions. So you had the English Revolution, which overthrew a Catholic monarch in the 1600s, and we don't really have too much time to get into that. You have the Glorious Revolution, where Parliament is actually given a lot more power after the 1680s. And over the course of the 1700s, Parliament actually gains more and more power, and Parliament is a representative body, and so people in Britain vote for who the representatives are going to be, even if the sort of voting base is still fairly restricted to people with property. But Parliament actually has a lot of power in the British Empire, more so than even the king. And so American colonists are often have major disagreements with the acts that Parliament passes. And so the American colonists actually appeal directly to the king for the king to actually sort of overrule Parliament on unpopular laws that are passed, like, for instance, the Stamp Act, which is a law that is passed to a stamp is placed on any paper or correspondence that's produced, and whenever these papers are stamped, there's like a tax on mailing papers and producing papers. It's effectively a paper tax, and colonists are very angry about this because they don't want to pay taxes. But from the sort of opinions of the Parliament's like, we just spent, hundreds of thousands of pounds defending you from Native American nations and from the French in North America, with huge British armies that were sent to North America for the defense of the American colonies. So Parliament's like, we need you to pay for your own defense. That's important, because we don't have any money anymore. But American colonists see this quite differently. They think that the American colonies are governed through charters, and what I mean by that is, back in the early 1600s, the king would give charters to specific groups of people to establish colonies. And so each of the colonies were established through these charters. So the Massachusetts Bay Colony had a charter that was established with the king. Virginia had a charter that was established with the king, which allowed Virginia and Massachusetts Bay to run their own affairs. And so they're saying that Parliament doesn't have any authority over them because they are governed through these charters that were established with the king. And meanwhile, the sort of politicians in Britain are like, this is ridiculous. We've been through so many different revolutions since these charters were established. All of these sort of charters you're talking about don't govern the American colonies. Parliament does. That was the whole point of the Glorious Revolution, right? Parliament now has control of these colonies. So there's a big philosophical difference between what American colonists want and what Britain sees their relationship with the American colonies as being. And so there's sort of a very famous slogan that American colonists adopt, where they say, no taxation without representation, and they're saying that they should be represented in Parliament. Of course, if Britain actually called them on this slogan, on this bluff, it wouldn't have mattered. There weren't enough people in the American colonies to actually change any of the passing of any of these laws. They wouldn't have even gotten many representatives in Parliament. And American colonists were smart people. They knew this. They knew that if they had representation in Parliament, these taxes would still be passed anyway, and then they wouldn't have an argument against the British Empire. And so it served effectively as a slogan. Really what the American colonists were arguing for is that political authority for the American colonists were established through the charter system. And because of that, the American colonies should have some autonomy to run their own affairs separate from Parliament. And Parliament, meanwhile, is arguing that they are the sole political authority that should control and regulate laws in the American colonies. And again, with a treasury that is significantly depleted from the 7 Years' War, this became very important because the British Empire had to raise that money from somewhere. And Parliament was saying, it should be raised from the American colonies because we spent a lot of money defending them. And so there are some major changes in communication that actually made this argument a little bit more, this argument between American colonists and Parliament to a little bit more fiery and radical. And the main thing is that printing presses were actually set up at an increasing rate between the 1760s and 1760 and 1770. And one journal in particular, the Pennsylvania Journal, actually sets up a printing press in Philadelphia and spreads their subscriber network through a lot of the northern part of the British colonies, as well as a lot of places in Virginia. And in fact, if you'll take a look at this map in the background here, you'll see these dots are subscribers of the Pennsylvania Journal. And you'll see there are lots of dots up in modern-day New England and New York City, and of course in Pennsylvania, and then down in coastal Virginia. And so lots of people were reading the Pennsylvania Journal. And so what was the Pennsylvania Journal saying at this time? Well, the Pennsylvania Journal was a radical newspaper arguing against British authority over American colonies and arguing especially for the actions against British authorities, opposing British parliamentary rule in the American colonies. And so it's through the spread of printing presses in the Atlantic, in the Atlantic world, and in the British colonies that actually radicalize a lot of American colonists against Great Britain during this time. So during the debate over the Stamp Act and over these new taxes that were passed on American colonists to pay for the 7 Years' War, many colonists in Boston and in Massachusetts treated taxation authorities and people who had the power to sort of impose these taxes on Americans quite harshly. And so if you were a tax assessor or you were an official of the British government, you could be targeted by mobs and kind of scared for your life. And so there are a few instances of this happening in Boston. And so the British Empire actually send some troops to occupy Boston to try to keep the order. In the early 1770, and maybe even as early as 1769. And so Boston is actually partially occupied by these troops who are kept quartered in a local government office in downtown Boston. And these troops begin to be the target of abuse by crowds. And so there are sort of many instances of crowds throwing rocks at British troops or snowballs at British troops in the winter of 1770. There's also tensions between individual American colonists and British troops in the streets, and part of the reason for this is that Boston, for the most part, is a fairly white and Protestant community, whereas most of the British troops were, in fact, not English. They were often Scottish or Scot-Irish or German or Catholic, and so this, to many Bostonians, feels like a sort of alien foreign occupying force. And so after a variety of sort of different disputes between a few individuals, a few dock workers, and British soldiers, and especially after the beating of one of these dock workers by British soldiers, and then the beating of a British soldier by these dock workers, sort of tensions are running high in the winter of 1770. And on one winter evening, a crowd starts to form in response to the beating of an American colonist. And this crowd starts throwing snowballs at British troops. And the sort of officer brings out the troops and tries to arrange in a defensive formation to deal with this crowd that's throwing snowballs and rocks. And at one point, it's hard to say, one of the British soldiers ends up firing their weapon. They claim that they heard their officer to say fire into the crowd, but once one person fires, the whole group sort of fires, and a number of American colonists are killed, including Crispus Attucks, who is a mixed race African American and Native American dock worker, and he's one of the one of the first casualties of this conflict between Britain and American colonists. And so after this affair, the British soldiers are arraigned. Many are arrested, actually, and there's this sort of big debate as to where are these British soldiers going to hold trial? And Parliament in Britain wants these soldiers to be tried in Britain, actually sailed back to Britain. American colonists are very much opposed to this. They're worried that these soldiers are going to essentially get off with shooting into a crowd. They're going to go scot-free if they're not tried in the colonies. And in fact, they end up being tried in the colonies and are actually acquitted of most of their charges due to the sort of confusion and at the time and the anger of the crowd. And John Adams, who will become president of the United States, the second president of the United States that actually defends the British soldiers in this trial. So in 1770, what this event called the Boston Massacre sort of occurs, but it's actually fairly amicably resolved. However, tensions between the British and the American colonists continues, and a variety of different acts are passed to try to again raise taxes on American colonists because the British government is trying to get revenue in order to replace their depleted revenue from the 7 Years' War, and so there are multiple taxes levied, including one tax called the Tea Act, which was going to tax British tea in the American colonies. And in response to this, a sort of unruly crowd of people dress up as Mohawk Native Americans and go into the harbor and find stores of tea waiting to be unloaded on a ship and toss it into the ocean. And this is what historians call the Tea Party, essentially. And sort of in response to this, Britain in Parliament passes a number of quite harsh measures called the Intolerable Acts, which include taking over part of Massachusetts government and increasing the number of troops in Boston, passing the Quartering Act, which allowed troops to be quartered in unoccupied buildings around Boston, meaning that there's not only this sort of small garrison of troops, but actually a large military presence during peacetime in the streets of Boston. And this really greatly inflames tensions. Because remember, the whole point of this, the whole argument here, is not just whether people are going to pay taxes or not. It's a matter of who actually has authority over the colonies. And Britain is saying very clearly Parliament has the authority. And in fact, one of their acts they pass is the Parliamentary Supremacy Act, which specifically states unequivocally Parliament has the right to tax American colonies and control decisions that are being made in the American colonies. And so this leads to a significant amount of tension in New England. But a few other sort of important things happen that increase tension in other American colonies as well. And so around this time, around 1772, there is a man by the name of James Somerset who is enslaved, and he is enslaved in North America, and his enslaver takes him to Britain essentially as a servant while he's in Britain. And James Somerset, when he arrives in London, sues for his freedom, goes to a court and says that he has been physically harmed by his enslaver, and that he should be free within side of England itself. And sort of one very interesting consequence of this is that the judge, this English judge, actually agrees and says that yes, James Somerset should be free. And while this judge does not specifically abolish slavery within Britain itself, his opinion is kind of construed that way. And so many people at the time start reporting that this judge has essentially abolished slavery in London and in the country of England. And so James Somerset actually goes free. And historians don't really know what happened to him after that, but he gains his freedom. But the Somerset decision has reverberations all throughout the Atlantic world. And Virginia planters start taking notice of this. And they kind of start putting two to two together here. So they say to themselves, okay, so if England has abolished slavery and Parliament is claiming authority over the American colonies, what's to prevent Parliament from passing a law ending slavery in the American colonies? And so Parliament was never going to do this, but what it leads to is significant paranoia among white plantation owners in the colonies in the South that Great Britain might actually end slavery. And so this leads to many white plantation owners that should be paying very close attention to the events happening in Boston, and encourages them to adopt a more anti-British stance. And this is no small thing. Think about all these sort of very important political leaders that participate in the Revolution: George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison. These are all people who are involved, who are members of that Virginia planter elite. So the Somerset decision is one, very important sort of cause of the American Revolution. So with the passage of the Intolerable Acts in 1774, tensions begin to run really high in the colony of Massachusetts, and real talk of rebellion actually begins. And part of what happens is, outside of the city of Boston, which again is controlled by the British Army, Massachusetts farmers begin forming militias and begin organizing, and begin sort of organizing against the British Empire, and perhaps beginning to rise in revolt. And so they start actually collecting weapons in parts of provincial Massachusetts, areas that today are like suburbs of Boston. And in April 1775, the British get word that these militias are organizing and collecting weapons, and the British Army goes out into these provincial towns and tries to capture or destroy these sort of arsenals that these militias are putting together. And this is how the revolution breaks out. The Revolutionary War breaks out, rather. And you have the battles of Lexington and Concord, where Massachusetts militiamen start forming up and fighting against British regulars attempting to seize their weapons. And eventually, at the end of these battles, the British Army is forced back into the city of Boston, and a number of battles sort of take place north of Boston over these heights that actually overlook Boston, as militias from throughout Massachusetts start organizing and fighting against the British. And it's around this time the Continental Congress, the Second Continental Congress convenes, and there is a sort of organization of not only the colony of Massachusetts, but other colonies throughout North America that begin to come together in revolt against the British Empire and join Massachusetts in rebellion. And one of sort of the original key questions is, who is going to lead the Americans' forces against the British? Because you can't rely on state militias to fight against one of the most powerful militaries in the world at the time, right? And so actually, at one of these Continental Congresses, George Washington shows up in his military uniform that he wore fighting in the 7 Years' War as a part of the British military. And he never really directly says he wants the job of leading the sort of armed forces, but sort of other delegates to take notice, and they're like, oh, hey, who should we pick to lead our forces? Oh, how about the guy who showed up in a military uniform? And so George Washington himself actually is very clearly wanted to lead the Continental Army, and is appointed as the leader of the main Continental Army that's going to fight against the British. So as the American Army and militias are attempting to take Boston from the British, the Americans sort of immediately turned their attention to Quebec, and they turned their attention to Canada. And so this would be kind of a theme in early American history. Americans always think that like Canadians will join them in their big revolt against Britain, and they especially think Quebec will because Quebec has a lot of French settlers and who generally do not like the British, and so immediately the Continental Congress and military leaders begin organizing an expedition against Montreal and Quebec City, and so they form an army in New York. That's sort of a mix of New York militia and Continental Army regulars. And they invade Quebec. And they're able to actually take Montreal and a few other small settlements in the southern part of the St. Lawrence River. But then they attack Quebec City, which at the time was the capital of Quebec and the main area of settlement. And their American attack on Quebec at the beginning of winter just fails pretty miserably. They have huge issues with supply, and they really underestimate the willingness of the French population of Quebec to revolt against the British. The French population doesn't actually share the same sort of grievances as the American colonies in New England, and with a combination of British regulars and Canadian militia, are actually able to expel and defeat this American force, and so. This is sort of an early defeat for the Patriots and the people and the colonists rebelling against Britain, as Canada continues to be held by Britain in this war. And so I'm not going to do sort of a blow by blow of the American Revolutionary War, but I do want to highlight some important aspects of it. One of the first important parts of the American Revolutionary War to understand is that the American Revolution is really a civil war. There are perhaps 40% of the population who are patriots, who are pro independence, and there's probably another 25 to 30% of the population that actually support Britain and are loyalists and support the British Empire. And a lot of the population, the remainder 30 to 40%, it's hard to say, historians still sort of debate this, really is neutral. They don't really care who controls the American colonies. They just want to farm, they want to live their regular lives, and they don't want to be bothered. And so what you see during the American Revolution is the Continental Army under George Washington might come into a city or a town, or local American militias might come in, and suddenly everyone in the streets are patriots, right? And then the British Army might throw out the local militia and occupy a city or a town, and suddenly your average person is now a firm supporter of Britain. And so there are lots of people who don't really want to choose sides, and choose sides based off of kind of whoever's winning in their local area. And so, however, there are some places that are more prominently loyalist and some that are more supportive of the Patriots. So Philadelphia is a much more sort of radical and anti-British city. So you'll remember I mentioned the Pennsylvania Journal is one of the most anti-British journals that's established in the American colonies. And so Philadelphia very much supports, for the most part, the American independence. Whereas New York City is actually a lot more tied to Britain. And part of this is because New York City is a very prominent city in North America and has a lot of commerce and commercial ties to Great Britain. And so they're worried that, if America gains independence, this new independent country might actually cut off trade with Britain, which is their lifeline. And so lots of merchants and business people in northern cities are actually very often loyalist and very much support the British Empire. And so the British actually control New York City for most of the war. Now, some of the early victories that the Continental Army and American militias have against the British Empire um, actually uh, sort of sort of almost catch them unaware, and they said it kind of assumed that it's going to be fairly easy taking on an organized British army. And so when Great Britain sends multiple armies into the American colonies, um, the Continental Army actually has a lot of goes through lots of defeats against the British Army in 1776 and 1777, and the part of the problem is American colonists don't actually know in the late 1700s how to properly fight on a battlefield. Um, they don't know how to form rank. They don't know how to properly aim their muskets in ways that are effective on the battlefield, and especially they have problems with morale. And so when the British Army comes with these organized line infantries and attacks American encampments, um, with organized marches and organized charges. American colonists often are quick to retreat and quick to break formation, which actually decreases the effectiveness of these sort of very inaccurate muskets, where they're more effective when people bunch up and fire together as a unit and in unison. And so this lack of professionalization really hurts the Continental Army. Um, and after sort of a series of defeats, George Washington actually nearly loses the entire Continental Army. The Continental Army is trapped on Long Island with very few ways to escape. They were already beaten in multiple battles. The British Army is very close to capturing the entire army, and very luckily, George Washington is sort of able to get away due to a sudden fog that comes down Long Island, and the army's able to get into boats and sail to the mainland. Um, and so, sort of the low point for the American army is they are stuck in Valley Forge, which is in sort of hills and mountains outside of Philadelphia, in a freezing winter with very little supplies, and sort of barely existing as a fighting force. But it's around this time that George Washington and other American officers train the Continental Army and try to professionalize and reform the Continental Army, and turn it into more of a European style fighting force. And so, contrary to sort of the myths of the American Revolution, that the British didn't know how to deal with ambush attacks, they didn't know how to deal with American sharpshooters. It's in fact the Continental Army adopting European practices of warfare that allows them to challenge the British Army in pitched battles in North America during the American Revolution. So as war breaks out on the North American continent, the Continental Congress realizes that they are not going to be able to win this conflict by themselves. The British Empire is just far too powerful, um, and this new nation, what will become the United States, is going to need international support and recognition and legitimacy. And so naturally they turn to the main enemy of the British Empire at the time, which is that of France. And ironically, while the American colonists, many American colonists served in the British military, fighting against the French just 12 years before, now they seek French support in order to try to fight against the British Empire. And so they dispatch Benjamin Franklin to Paris in order to try to convince the French to join the Americans in a war against Britain. And so Benjamin Franklin tries to convince French administrators to join this conflict and to formally declare war on Britain. But the French are very reluctant because they don't yet actually see a significant amount of American success. And so at the time in 1776 and in early 1777, the Americans were able to repel the British army from Boston, but they failed in their invasion of Quebec. Um, the British Army actually occupies large sections of New York and New Jersey. George Washington sort of barely escapes often from the British Army. Um, and so American colonists didn't actually have a whole lot of success against the British Army around this time. And, and so in order to secure this international support, uh, Franklin needs the Continental Army to win a major battle against against the British to sort of prove that the Americans can actually win this war. And so there are some sort of clandestine shipments of weapons to the Americans from French sympathizers, but for the most part, Franklin's not making much leeway, making much progress with the French at this point. However, around this moment, a very important battle is fought that actually gives Franklin enough diplomatic credibility to get the French to directly enter this war on the side of the Americans, and that's the Battle of Saratoga. So the Continental Army is able to actually fight against a British army sent from Quebec under a general named Burgoyne. And the sort of British plans to capture George Washington's Continental Army go awry. And in upstate New York, around modern day Albany, the Continental Army not only wins a major victory against Burgoyne's forces, but actually captures the entire army. And suddenly, Britain doesn't actually have a standing army in North America. And so the news of this huge success sort of balance out the sort of American losses of major cities like Philadelphia and New York City to smaller British forces, and sort of proves that the Americans can actually fight and defeat the British Army in battle and are worthy of French support. And so Franklin is actually able to secure a commitment from France, and France formally joins the Americans. And this will prove crucial because it's only with the support of the French, including with weapons and arms and shipments and supplies being sent to the American army, but also the French Navy, which can actually attack the British Navy on the seas and provides crucial naval support for the Americans. And all of this support is crucial for the Americans eventually emerging victorious against the British Empire. So as the front of the American Revolutionary War shifted south with the defeat of British regulars at the Battle of Saratoga, New York and the lands of the Iroquois Confederacy in modern-day upstate New York become a major theater for irregular warfare. And this is because the American Revolutionary War not only divided American colonists, but also divided Native American nations. And the Iroquois Confederacy itself was divided over who to support in this war. And so the Seneca, the Mohawk, Cayuga, and Onondaga largely support the British in this war, though there are actually some Cayuga villages who declare neutrality in this war. Whereas the Oneida and Tuscarora nations choose to support the Americans. And this is because those nations in particular had many converts to Presbyterianism and had connections to many pro-American and anti-British Presbyterian missionaries. And so this area in New York becomes a place of a huge civil war and patriot militias going around and attacking loyalist villages, both American villages and also American Loyalist villages and also Haudenosaunee Loyalist villages, like the villages of the Seneca or the Mohawk. Meanwhile, uh, Mohawk raiders actually attack American settlements and attack pro-American villages in upstate New York. And one of the most the prominent leaders of the Mohawks at the time was a person by the name of Joseph Brant, who had a lot of connections to British officials and was very strongly pro-British. And so, under Joseph Brant, the vast majority of Mohawks actually oppose the Americans. And so Joseph Brand and his Mohawk Raiders are actually quite successful at attacking pro-American villages throughout the areas of in New York and in Pennsylvania, and are actually quite effective at targeting patriot militias at the time. And it's worth mentioning this is sort of a very irregular war of raids from different forces on villages, and so this isn't like two armies meeting and fighting each other. Often it's skirmishes, or it's sometimes targeting civilians. And Joseph Brant and his Mohawk Raiders definitely did target civilians in this region. And so when the British Army is kicked out of New York, George Washington sees this as an opportunity to directly attack the Iroquois Confederacy. And it's worth mentioning his goals in this attack on the Iroquois Confederacy is not solely to destroy the military power of the Iroquois Confederacy, but is actually to target civilians and to ethnically cleanse this area, to remove the Iroquois Confederacy from upstate New York so that eventually American settlers can take control of this territory. And so he goes to many different American officers and asks if they're willing to lead an expedition into the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. And some actually, American generals like Horatio Gates, for instance, actually turned down this offer of this command. So it goes to a officer of lesser rank, John Sullivan, who agrees to lead this expedition into the Haudenosaunee lands, or the Iroquois Confederacy. And George Washington gives them very specific instructions. He says to John Sullivan, you should target villages, you should target the fields of these Iroquois towns, and you should burn down these fields, burn down these houses, and target civilians, and eliminate Iroquois presence from this land. And the idea here is to starve out, essentially, Joseph Brant and his Mohawk Raiders, and starve out the people of the Iroquois Confederacy. And specifically, George Washington tells Sullivan, do not under any circumstances make peace with the Mohawk, the Seneca, the Onondaga, and the Cayuga nations until all of their villages are destroyed. And so really what George Washington is telling John Sullivan to do is to embark on a campaign of ethnic cleansing against the Iroquois Confederacy, and to target civilians and destroy their land. And many historians argue that this is not just actually a campaign of ethnic cleansing, it is specifically a campaign of genocide. And so in 1799, John Sullivan and a large American force goes out to Seneca and Cayuga villages and destroys them. And it destroys a substantial amount of number of villages, dozens of towns, and hundreds of thousands of bushels of corn. And so you can see on this map the Seneca villages located in modern-day Western New York, and the Cayuga villages and Onondaga villages located in modern-day Central New York. And notice on this map how all these village names say to 1779, because the villages are wiped off this map by John Sullivan and his army. And Thousands of refugees flee these towns and flee to Fort Niagara around modern day Niagara Falls. And Fort Niagara was a fort run by the British. And these Iroquois refugees asked the British, begged the British for food, as sort of tent encampments are set up outside of modern day Niagara Falls, and Iroquois refugees are desperate for British help. And the British at the time don't actually have a lot of food to support this many refugees. And so the next winter of 1780, around roughly 30 to 50% of the Iroquois population dies of starvation and disease, as they do not have enough food to feed themselves. And in fact, it's only the emergence of a cicada brood, actually, in beginning in 1780, that the civilians are able to recover, and they live off of cicadas. They go and grab cicadas and roast them over the fire, and that's what they live off of in 1780. So the Sullivan Campaign is a devastating campaign of ethnic cleansing and arguably genocide. And the sort of shocking thing about this is the Iroquois Confederacy loses 30 to 50% of the population, and yet this campaign of ethnic cleansing is not even successful. And in 1780 and 1781, the Iroquois Confederacy is able to recover. They are able to reoccupy some of their towns and villages. And the raids of Joseph Brant and his Mohawk Raiders and that of Seneca forces are actually able to successfully still attack American settlements in 1780 and 1781. This is not militarily. This is actually not successful. And the last thing that's sort of worth mentioning about the Sullivan Campaign is it's explicitly not discriminatory. And so John Sullivan and his army go into some of the Cayuga villages that declared neutrality, weren't even supporting the British, and burn them down. And this begins sort of a history of Americans not actually discriminating against what nation Native Americans are from. And some Americans beginning to develop very racist mentalities towards Native Americans overall, and not even distinguishing between allies and enemies. And that becomes sort of a very sort of clear trend in U.S. relations with Native American peoples into the 1800s, as even Native American peoples in groups who ally with the United States government find their land stolen and taken away anyway. And so I mention all this because I just think it's a very important thing that happens in the American Revolution that's often ignored. So during the Revolutionary War, enslaved peoples had very difficult choices to make. And they chose to join either the American side or the British side, depending on which side they would think would most likely secure their freedom. And so, in the North, enslaved peoples were very divided over whether to join the British or the Americans. And this is partially because the North at this time was a little bit different, especially in New England. These were the sort of New England colonies, Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island, New Hampshire, were places where slavery existed and people were enslaved, but they were not societies built around slavery. And so you had African Americans who were enslaved in these areas, but you also had large populations of free African Americans who were not enslaved. And so there existed a sort of future for enslaved peoples that they could very clearly see. And so many African Americans in the North chose to use service and the Continental Army as leverage to try to gain freedom for themselves. And so they petitioned the Continental Army to allow them to serve and fight against the British, and then use that service as a way of saying, you know, you claim to be fighting for equality and for and say all men are created equal. So why not me? And and um, and say we fought against the British just like you did. So we should be free from our enslaved condition. And they're quite successful in petitioning Americans in the North to allow them to join the Continental Army. And sure enough, Rhode Island actually passes a law saying that enslaved African Americans are allowed to join the Continental Army, fight against the British, and that after their service in the military, they will be free. And 140 men answer that call and make up the majority of the troops and of the 1st Rhode Island Regiment. And these men are actually able to secure their own freedom by service to the Continental Army. However, this was a minority of African Americans in North America who actually made this decision to join the Americans. The vast majority of enslaved peoples see Britain as the entity that's going to be able to actually ensure their freedom in this war, and they do so for some very good reasons. So while there are a few New England states that allow enslaved peoples to actually fight for the Continental Army, this does not happen in the South. This does not happen in Virginia. This does not happen in South Carolina. And unlike in New England, these are not societies that just happen to have slavery. These are slave societies. These are societies in which slavery is integral as an economic and social institution, and slavery is not going to go away under American rule. And in fact, it's actually the British who are more likely to give enslaved peoples their freedom. And so as the war moves south, and as the British, realizing their campaigns in New England and in New York have failed, they try to actually invade parts of the American South in 1779 and 1780. And a prominent British general, Henry Clinton, who's involved in this invasion, when he arrives in North America, actually issues a proclamation called the Philipsburg Proclamation, which says to the enslaved population in Virginia and South Carolina and Georgia, if you run to British lines, we will employ you, we will integrate you into our military, and we will give you freedom. So run away, come join us, and come and fight for your freedom. And African Americans by far answered this call. And so in Georgia, 5,000 enslaved peoples actually escape to British lines and try to join the British military. And the sort of response to the Philipsburg Proclamation is so great that the British actually don't even have enough supplies to support the number of African American refugees seeking work and seeking to join the military. And so the vast majority of enslaved peoples, in fact, see the British as their key to freedom, and don't side with the Americans. And to the credit of the British military, following the American Revolutionary War and the defeat of the British, white American planters try to come, and enslavers try to come to the British military figures and petition the British government and say, and try to claim and re-enslave people who escaped slavery. And the British military and many British officials say, no, we are not returning people who we promised freedom to. And in fact, 3,000 African Americans who had successfully escaped to British lines are relocated to Nova Scotia, given land, and Black Canadian communities are formed following the American Revolution that are free and free from American slavery. And so it's in fact the British who offer the greatest chance for African Americans to escape slavery during the American Revolution. So eventually, the Continental Army is able to successfully win the American Revolutionary War by trapping General Cornwallis, a British general that came over with a large army um, and attacked the South, by trapping his army in Yorktown, Virginia, on the coast of Virginia. And it's through a sort of a long campaign and a series of sort of sieges. And it's through, importantly, a French fleet blockading and cutting off the supplies of this British army that George Washington and his troops are actually able to trap this additional British army at Yorktown, which leads to the surrender of this army and the victory of the United States over the British Empire. The British Empire says we're not going to send any more armies here. We're now in a multi-front war with France, and even Spain joined in, and so Britain basically sues for peace, recognizes the United States and as an entity, and it effectively ends the war. And so there are sort of multiple consequences from the end of the American Revolution. First thing is that, remember, the American Revolution was a civil war. There were many people supporting the British Empire. There were many people supporting the Patriots, and there were many people who were neutral. And so, at the end of the war, you have a lot of communities of people who supported the creation of a new republic of the United States. They know which of their neighbors supported the British. And you, in fact, get a lot of reprisals against loyalists of the British Empire, where people attack them in the streets, try to take their houses, try to take their property. Certain people are brought up on charges of treason. So it's very dangerous to be a loyalist at the end of the American Revolution. And so, in fact, you have a migration of thousands and thousands of people who are loyalists, who supported the British Empire, and they know they're going to be under threat from political violence in this new republic. And so they move to Canada, which remains as a British possession in North America, and they resettle in modern-day Ontario. And so, Canada's population actually increases quite substantially from this loyalist migration. And so the victory of the Americans in this war has an effect on sort of political geography. So the American Revolution, if you really look at the war of the American Revolution, it sort of contains kernels in it that show what the United States would be as a newly emergent republic. So in the Revolutionary War, the revolting colonies were more expansionistic against native nations than the British government was. They engaged in a brutal war against the Haudenosaunee Confederacy that really bordered on ethnic cleansing and genocide. The new nation was also a lot more pro-slavery than the British Empire was. And so you saw enslaved peoples throughout the modern American South join the British in trying to stop the American Revolution, because enslaved peoples realized that American colonists were in fact more pro-slavery than the British Empire was, and that within the British Empire, enslaved peoples might actually be able to gain their freedom much quicker. However, the American Revolutionary War also contained a radical minority that actually did believe in the sort of opinions and and of the sort of mottos of the American Revolution. They believed in radical equality, and they believed in egalitarianism. The American Revolution also changes society in North America. And so enslaved peoples who, some who fought for the Continental Army against the British in New England, see an opportunity with in this new republic, and they petition the government for their freedom. They say, okay, we are now a new nation where, you know, uh, this new nation argued for that everyone should be free, right? Everyone should be free and equal. And so they take the slogans of the American Revolution and they say, why don't they apply to me? And so that's you actually get a lot of petitions to courts asking for freedom from slavery. And one of these individuals who petitions for their freedom is a person by the name of Quock Walker, who was an enslaved person in Massachusetts. He records many instances where his enslaver actually beat him and physically harmed him, and says, under this new republic where all men are supposedly created equal, why not me? Why should I be subject to this abuse? And says, you know, the natural state of man is freedom, and I should be free. And the thing is in Massachusetts, a judge rules on his behalf and says, yes, you should. In this new nation, slavery should not be allowed in the state of Massachusetts. And so this actually leads to Quock Walker's freedom, and it leads to the erosion of slavery as an institution in Massachusetts by the Supreme Court, the Massachusetts Supreme Court, and by many other people like Quock Walker bringing suits to judges and saying, I am subjected to physical abuse, and that is unlawful, and therefore I should be free. And slavery as an institution is mostly eliminated in Massachusetts in 1790. Quite similarly, slavery is also eliminated in Pennsylvania as well. And so what you see with the sort of U.S. victory in this Revolutionary War, you see people who were oppressed under colonial society, use this rhetoric of freedom to try to change their own lives for the better, and to try to push this new republic to actually live up to its slogans and its ideals for an equal and free society. And this is what leads to a lot of the North by the 1820s and 1830s actually being mostly devoid of slavery. And slavery as an institution is fully eliminated in places like Massachusetts and Pennsylvania, and is on the decline in places like New York and New Jersey and Connecticut. So the revolution itself helps to end slavery in a good portion of the country. And so that's the question I want to leave you with today. Because the American Revolution leads to a lot of questions in American society. Who is American? Should African Americans be considered as citizens of this new society, right? Should women have the right to vote? These were major questions that the American Revolution brought up. And so, just like you had people like Quock Walker and others challenge the institution of slavery, you have prominent women in American society, you know, begin to petition their husbands and other prominent political leaders in their lives and say, why don't I have the right to vote? And so Abigail Adams actually constantly has discussions with John Adams, the second president of the United States and a prominent Revolutionary War leader, saying, you're saying all people are created equal. Well, that means I should have the right to vote. And you see the beginnings of the women's suffrage movement around this time as well. And so you have all these questions. Who belongs in this new republic? Will Native Americans belong? Will enslaved African Americans belong? Will women belong? And then you get these larger questions. What's the role of a Republican government? What makes a Republican government different from a monarchy? How should we educate our population? How should we encourage democratic participation? What does democracy even look like? And so these questions really begin to take hold in the society. And it's in the period of the early republic that you, in fact, have a lot of arguments between different parts of society. Try to envision what this republic is going to look like. Because remember, most societies around this time are monarchies. They are not democracies. And so there are very few, actually, examples of what a democracy is supposed to look like. And so there is this big internal debate over that. And so we will be going over that in our next session, where we look at revolutions in North America, and we look at the development of the Constitution and the debates over the Constitution. So I had promised that this would have been a shorter lecture. I apologize, that did not happen. If you made it this far, thank you very much. I appreciate it. But I do think these sort of questions are really, really crucial. And so I hope this look at the American Revolution gave a sort of different look at it, right? One that included a lot of different voices than just sort of the battles and the leaders and stuff like that. So anyway, we will pick up with the making and crafting of the Constitution for our next lecture. Thank you very much. I appreciate it.